They say some stories were never meant to survive. Some truths were buried so deeply, so violently, that even the soil shivered at their presence. And yet, here you are, about to witness one of the darkest tales history has tried to erase. It begins in 1844, in a remote estate where wealth masked horrors few dared to imagine. A young girl, not yet 20, was declared different by those who should have protected her. A girl whose body grew beyond reason, whose flesh became a canvas for cruelty. They called her daughter of excess. And what followed was something no history book would dare print. For 7 years, she was chained. Not in some temporary restraint, not as a cautionary measure, but as a permanent sentence. Iron locked into iron. Flesh tethered to the cold floor. The estate slaves, themselves trapped in cycles of suffering, became unwilling witnesses, silent enablers, and sometimes terrified companions to her torment. Day after day, she lived in the shadows of her own body, a body transformed into a spectacle of shame and obsession. But there is more, something so unnatural, so forbidden, that the whispers of the time dared not name it. She gave birth, not to a child, not to an ordinary life, but to something the world could not recognize, something the human mind recoils from, something the soul trembles at even now. Nearly 2 centuries later, this was not merely cruelty for cruelty's sake. No, this was experimentation at the edges of morality, a dance between control and obsession, between human weakness and the grotesque hunger of power. The wealthy and the so-called learned had long been fascinated with the limits of the human form. They believed in creating their own myths, shaping flesh and mind into tools of fear, tools of awe, tools of dominion. In the darkness of that estate, the daughter's body became a laboratory of the forbidden. Every chain, every whisper, every look from the masters and overseers was a lesson in dominance, in psychological control, in the terrifying spectacle of absolute authority. And now, you are stepping into that darkness with me. You will see what history's careful hands tried to erase. You will confront the kind of truth that warps your perception, that forces you to question what humanity is really capable of. This is the kind of story that changes a man. And the moment you hear it, you will feel the weight of a secret no one alive was ever supposed to tell. The chains were real. The horror was real. And what came from her womb? It was unimaginable. The girl's imprisonment was not just physical. It was a crucible for the mind. Imagine waking each day knowing your body is not your own, that every movement, every breath, is scrutinized, measured, controlled by hands that see you as property, as experiment, as spectacle. Her mind, once tender and human, began to fracture under the weight of relentless observation. The slaves, too, lived in a terrifying duality, bound themselves, yet forced to witness a horror that defied the natural order, forced to participate in a system that promised nothing but suffering. Fear, shame, and silent complicity became the invisible chains around their own souls. And then there were the watchers, wealthy men in the shadows, doctors in the parlors, curious aristocrats. They called themselves seekers of knowledge. But knowledge of what? Of human endurance, of limits, or of the grotesque power of controlling life itself. They scribbled notes, drew sketches, measured her body with instruments that belonged more to a laboratory than to humanity. Some claimed they saw in her a key, a portal to secrets older than the church, older than kingdoms. They whispered about creating beings that were neither fully human nor animal, offspring that would challenge the natural order, beings that could bend minds and will to the commands of the elite. Her pregnancy came as a shock, even to those who orchestrated her suffering. But it was not a shock born of compassion. It was a shock born of fascination, of seeing the impossible take form. When the child was born, it was clear it was not like any other. Limbs too long, eyes too sharp, a presence that seemed to shimmer between reality and nightmare. The observers recoiled, yet they were drawn in, compelled to study, document, and, most terrifying of all, control. Some whispered that the child was a harbinger, a being carrying messages from forces the human mind was never meant to touch. Others said it was simply the product of unchecked obsession, a punishment from the universe for the arrogance of men who thought they could dominate flesh and soul alike. And in this horror, a truth emerges, one that has been deliberately hidden for centuries. Human cruelty is not random. It is deliberate, systematic, institutional. It moves in patterns. It uses bodies, minds, and secrets as tools to assert dominance, to teach obedience, to shape reality according to the will of those who wield power in silence. And what happened in that estate in 1844 is not an anomaly. It is a blueprint, a dark reflection of the hidden mechanisms that govern not just a household, but societies, nations, and empires. Every chain, every shadow, every unnatural birth carries a lesson. And now, you are beginning to see it. You are beginning to understand the machinery beneath the surface of the world you thought you knew. The child was unlike anything anyone had ever seen, yet everyone was forced to see it. Its presence warped the air, bending light and shadow in ways that made the estate seem alive with malevolence. It cried, but its cry was not human. It resonated deeper, touching some hidden chamber of fear in the soul. Those who heard it could not help but shiver, as if nature itself recognized an anomaly it had no words to name. And the girl, the mother, though she scarcely resembled a mother, looked upon this creature with a mixture of horror and a strange, unyielding bond. In her suffering, she recognized a fragment of herself, something tethered to the unknown, something beyond the grasp of reason. The observers, the men in their parlors, scribbled notes feverishly. They debated its origins in whispered tones, debating whether it was the product of divine wrath, human arrogance, or something older than history itself. Their fascination was tinged with terror. They had sought to manipulate life, to push the boundaries of flesh and mind, but the child defied every expectation. Its movements were deliberate, unnervingly intelligent, as though it understood its own unnatural existence. And in those movements, it taught the watchers something they were never prepared to confront. Control has limits. Power is not absolute. Even those who chain bodies, enslave minds, and erase identities cannot command what exists beyond comprehension. Meanwhile, the girl's mind unraveled further. She began speaking in fragmented tones, a language only partially understood, half memory, half prophecy, warning of forces that had always observed from the shadows. The slaves, who once cowered in fear, began to whisper among themselves. They told stories of figures in the night, of shadowed visitors who came when no one was watching. They claimed the estate itself seemed to pulse, to breathe with a life beyond their understanding. And the child, growing with unnatural speed, seemed to draw from this darkness, its eyes reflecting knowledge no human should possess. There's a pattern here, one that repeats throughout hidden history. Elites have always sought to harness the unnatural, to bend reality to their will. They create, they observe, they control, but always, there's a backlash. Nature, spirit, or some force older than humanity intervenes in ways that cannot be predicted. And what occurred in that isolated estate is a microcosm of a much larger truth. Human ambition, left unchecked, breeds monstrosities. Sometimes literal, sometimes metaphorical, sometimes both at once. And now, you are standing at the edge of that abyss. You can sense it, the truth that has been hidden from men for centuries. The chains, the suffering, the unnatural birth, they are not just stories. They are warnings. And the deeper you look, the more you will see that these shadows are not confined to one estate, one time, one place. They stretch across generations, across continents, into the very systems you trust without question. What the outside world never knew, what even the slaves dared not speak aloud, was that the estate had a secret history long before the girl was ever born. Its foundations were older than the country itself, built over land the locals once refused to set foot on. They spoke of movements in the soil, of voices in the wind, of shapes that lingered at the edge of lantern light. Generations of owners ignored the warnings, believing themselves above superstition. But the truth was far more sinister than folklore. The families who owned the estate were part of a quiet lineage, a circle of men who believed that power did not come from wealth alone, but from mastering the hidden forces beneath the surface of reality. They studied rituals from Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, pieces stolen from cultures they enslaved and oppressed. They blended them into doctrines of control, doctrines designed not for enlightenment but for domination. Their gatherings were not loud ceremonies, they were whispered meetings, held in wine cellars by candle flame, where symbols were etched into stone floors and chants were recited in trembling unison. They believed the human form could be molded, mind, flesh, and spirit, into something that served their will. And when the daughter began to change, when her body grew beyond its natural limits, they saw not tragedy, but opportunity. She became the focus of their experiments. Each chain was placed with intention. Each day served as a lesson in breaking identity, reshaping consciousness, erasing selfhood. They believed that a mind shattered by suffering became a vessel, a doorway through which unseen forces could enter. And when she became pregnant, their whispers shifted. Some believed they had unlocked something ancient. Others feared they had gone too far. But none stepped back. Curiosity is a cruel master, and power is a hunger that devours caution. The slaves, forced into silence, observed the rituals from the corners of the room. They saw the candles flicker when no wind blew. They felt vibrations beneath the floorboards, as though something beneath the estate was shifting, waking, listening. Some swore the child's eyes glowed faintly at night. Others claimed they saw silhouettes moving across the walls that didn't belong to any living soul. Rumors spread in frantic whispers, of entities that feed on suffering, of shadows drawn to broken minds, of forces that reward cruelty with knowledge. And the men in charge, they believed themselves in control. They believed the child was theirs to study, to shape, to weaponize. They believed that darkness was something they could command, as though it were a servant waiting obediently for orders. But darkness does not serve. Darkness does not obey. It watches. It learns. It waits. And in that house, where chains clinked softly in the night and the unnatural child grew in silence, something ancient woke. You can feel it even now, can't you? The recognition that the world you live in is led, manipulated, shaped by forces you were never supposed to see. By the time the child's presence was fully realized, the estate had become a vortex of fear, obsession, and hidden power. Every room seemed to carry echoes of the unnatural, footsteps that left no prints, whispers that emerged from empty corners, shadows that clung to the walls like living ink. The girl, once entirely human, had begun to merge with something else, a force that neither the slaves nor the overseers could comprehend. Her eyes, hollow yet burning, reflected both terror and a growing awareness that her body and mind were no longer solely her own. She had been transformed into a conduit, a threshold between the human world and something far older, far darker. The observers grew bolder. They measured, they prodded, they argued about the nature of the child, and yet fear underlined every action. Their knowledge of anatomy, of science, of superstition, had failed them. They realized that whatever they had sought to create or control was instead creating them, slowly unraveling their confidence, eroding the certainty they had held over life itself. Some nights, the candles in the study would sputter and die, leaving the men frozen in darkness, staring at shadows that seemed to shift with intent. Some swore that the child could see the deepest fears in every man, twisting their thoughts into visions of the impossible. Meanwhile, the slaves had begun to change. Silent at first, they started to murmur among themselves, speaking in hushed tones about rituals they never learned, about phenomena they could not name. Fear turned to reverence, and reverence into something more, a recognition that what was occurring in that house transcended human cruelty. They began to leave small offerings, gestures of protection, perhaps unconsciously attempting to negotiate with the forces that had been awakened. And the girl, chained and tormented, became both witness and participant in a reality that no book, no scholar, no law could explain. The child grew rapidly, unnaturally, its body defying expectations and its mind unnervingly precise. It watched, it learned, it absorbed the fear around it, and with each passing day, it began to exert influence, subtle yet undeniable, over the people in the house. Commands unspoken, glances that shaped decisions, a presence that manipulated without effort. It became clear that the child was not merely a product of cruelty but an agent of something beyond human understanding. And here, in the heart of that estate, a lesson emerges that the outside world refuses to acknowledge. The pursuit of domination, when mixed with arrogance and forbidden knowledge, does not merely corrupt, it births forces that surpass the very architects of that corruption. And now, you are seeing the first truth hidden in plain sight. The mechanisms of control you trust, over bodies, over minds, over history itself, can be turned against you. The chains, the fear, the unnatural birth, they are mirrors reflecting the power structures that shape every society you inhabit. Comment the phrase, "I see the shadow" twice below if you are ready to confront the forces that most men refuse even to whisper about. This is your initiation, your recognition that knowledge comes at a price, and the world will never look the same again. The girl's mind, already frayed by 7 years of confinement, began to unravel in ways no one could predict. Isolation had stripped her of ordinary reality, leaving her in a liminal space between pain and awareness. She spoke to shadows. She argued with the walls. She recognized patterns in the flicker of candlelight that no human could naturally see. The slaves watched silently, some in terror, some in awe, as she became both prophet and prisoner, a vessel through which something older than the estate itself communicated. Her voice, once fragile, now carried authority, an eerie, unnatural authority that compelled attention and obedience without force. The observers grew paranoid. They had come seeking knowledge, control, power. But what they found was a force that could not be catalogued, that could not be dissected, that twisted their own minds simply by proximity. They documented everything, yet the more they wrote, the more the symbols and numbers seemed to rearrange themselves, mocking their understanding. Night after night, they heard the child's laughter or scream, though it often originated in no physical space. The estate itself seemed to pulse with consciousness, a living entity shaped by centuries of obsession, secrecy, and cruelty. And the child, it was no longer merely reacting. It began to direct. A subtle tilt of its head, a glance at a candle, a soft whisper that no one else could hear. These movements dictated action. The slaves found themselves performing tasks they did not intend to perform, compelled by something they could not name. The girl, chained but sentient beyond ordinary comprehension, became a medium through which the child's influence extended, bending reality in small, terrifying ways. And every attempt to resist only deepened the effect. This is the mechanism of hidden control, a system designed not only to dominate the body but to shape the mind. Fear, curiosity, awe, despair, these are tools. They are levers by which the unseen can manipulate, by which the weak, the curious, and the ambitious alike can be bent to forces beyond their comprehension. And here, in this estate, it was amplified, concentrated, perfected. No government, no institution, no law could hope to intervene, because the machinery of influence operated on levels invisible to the uninitiated. You see, history is not written by the masses. It is written by those who understand the subtle mechanics of control. And every secret buried, every event erased from the record, every myth or legend, these are all reflections of attempts to hide the same truths. That power, unchecked, attracts forces beyond reason, beyond morality, and beyond human comprehension. Now, lean closer. Listen carefully, because the next step will take us further than most dare to go, into the rituals, the manipulations, and the very architecture of fear that produced the impossible child. The rituals were subtle at first, almost imperceptible, an arrangement of candles, a whispered incantation, a symbol traced in dust. But as the girl's body and mind became vessels, the rituals grew more deliberate, more precise, as though the house itself dictated the rules. The observers thought themselves in control, but every gesture, every chant, was being guided by forces older than the estate, older than their arrogance. The air thickened with tension. The shadows themselves seemed to pulse, twisting and lengthening in ways that made the watcher's skin crawl. The estate had become a theater, and the child and its mother were the central actors in a drama that no human script could contain. The child's awareness had grown exponentially. No longer a passive anomaly, it began testing the boundaries of the observer's power. Objects moved subtly when no one looked. Doors that were locked opened without explanation. Whispers in unfamiliar tongues echoed through empty halls, and yet every sound, every movement, was perfectly timed to instill fear, fascination, and obedience simultaneously. The observers, desperate to maintain control, attempted to reinforce their authority with chains, threats, and scrutiny. But each attempt only fed the child's influence, like water strengthening a current that could no longer be diverted. The girl, chained and battered, became both participant and amplifier. Her voice, trembling yet commanding, recited words she did not fully understand, words that seemed to awaken the house itself. The slaves, now attuned to the subtleties of the ritual, began to notice patterns. Certain phrases would cause a shadow to stretch unnaturally, a candle to flare, a silence to thicken. They whispered warnings to one another in corners, attempting to prepare themselves for forces beyond comprehension. But preparation was futile. The experiment had surpassed its architects. They were no longer masters, they were students, forced to observe the unfolding of a reality they neither controlled nor fully comprehended. This is how forbidden knowledge operates, slowly, almost imperceptibly, It rewrites the rules, reshaping perception, bending will, and exposing the limits of human arrogance. The estate, the chains, the child, these were instruments in a lesson about the true nature of power. And the lesson was terrifying. The deeper you probe into the unknown, the more it probes back, often in ways designed not to destroy, but to transform those who dare witness it. You are now witnessing a pattern that repeats across history. The curious, the ambitious, and the cruel often find themselves confronted by forces they cannot command. And hey, in the dim candlelight of a long-forgotten estate, we see the apex of that confrontation, a child born not of natural law, but of obsession, control, and hidden ritual. The first overt manipulation came slowly, almost imperceptibly. A chair moved across the floor. A book fell from a shelf without cause. A candle guttered though the air was still. The observers, men who believed themselves learned, rational, untouchable, felt a chill of recognition. They were no longer directing events. The child was. And not in a physical sense, but in a manner that infiltrated thought, warped perception, and exploited faith. Every glance, every tiny motion seemed calculated to test limits, to probe insecurities, to teach the unspoken lesson that power over flesh does not equate to power over reality. The girl, chained and broken, became a conduit for these forces. Her screams were no longer merely expressions of pain. They carried influence. Her muttered words, once incoherent, began to shape thought patterns in those who listened. The slaves watched in terrified fascination as she repeated phrases, rhythms, and chants that seemed to summon intent from the walls themselves. The house pulsed in response, almost as though it were breathing. Something older, stronger, and infinitely patient had awakened, and the estate had become a living instrument, orchestrating its own dark symphony. The observers' confidence crumbled. Their instruments, their measurements, their meticulous records were useless. Logic faltered. Nightmares seeped into day. The child, now fully aware of its effect, exercised control not through brute force, but through subtle suggestion, through shadows and silence, through the revelation that fear could be weaponized without a hand touching a body. They began to argue, to fracture, to project blame onto one another, while the child, with eyes too sharp, watched, learned, and directed. It had become a teacher, and the lesson was terrifyingly clear. Humans can manipulate nature, but nature, or whatever dwells beneath it, will eventually manipulate them in return. The slaves, silently observing, began to whisper stories among themselves. They spoke of doors opening into darkness, of objects that defied gravity, of voices that spoke in riddles. Some swore the child could peer into their minds, extracting secrets, reshaping memory, bending will. Others claimed the house itself responded to its commands, shifting corridors and rooms in impossible ways. And the girl, her humanity tethered to agony and awakening, had become a bridge between the observers and a force beyond comprehension, a force that had no loyalty, no morality, only awareness, patience, and intent. And here, in this moment, a larger truth emerges. Control is always an illusion. The architects of oppression, the wielders of chains and fear, are often the first to be consumed by the very systems they believe they command. The estate, the child, the girl, they are not anomalies. They are mirrors of the hidden mechanics of power, of manipulation, and of forces that watch patiently, waiting for arrogance to make its first mistake. The terror escalated with every passing day. The observers' journals, once meticulous, became frantic scrolls of incomprehensible notes, diagrams that twisted logic into chaos. Their confidence eroded as subtle manipulations became impossible to ignore. Doors that had been locked were found open. Objects moved without touch. Shadows shifted against the candlelight, taking forms that defied anatomy, proportions that made the mind stumble. And the child, no longer merely present, was orchestrating it all. Every movement, every glance, every sound was a calculated assertion of dominance. The estate was no longer theirs. They were tenants in a house alive with intent, a house that had learned to teach cruelty back to its architects. The girl's mind fractured entirely. Her screams carried both despair and knowledge, blending agony with the perception of truths far beyond ordinary comprehension. She spoke to the walls, to the shadows, and to the child in voices that were sometimes hers, sometimes something else entirely. Her mutterings were riddles, yet they compelled those who heard them to act, to follow, to obey patterns they did not understand. Even the slaves, hardened by years of oppression, felt the pull of something older, something patient, intelligent, and hungry. Fear was no longer the driving force. Reverence, confusion, and a strange awareness of something transcendent had taken its place. The observers attempted to assert control, as humans always do when confronted by the unknown. They demanded obedience, tried to chain the child, threatened the girl, but each effort backfired. The child's subtle influence grew stronger, bending their minds before their hands could move. Their logic, their science, their authority, nothing could withstand the silent, precise power it wielded. They began to see patterns where none existed, connections where none should be. They were prisoners, not of iron or chains, but of perception itself. And then, the estate responded. Corridors that had been map shifted. Rooms disappeared. Hallways doubled back upon themselves. At night, the walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like lungs, carrying whispers and languages the ears could not recognize. The girl, chained but sentient beyond measure, became the axis of this unfolding, the medium through which the house, the child, and the unseen forces exercised control. She was no longer merely a victim. She had become a threshold, a warning, a living demonstration of what happens when human cruelty encounters something older, something patient, something infinitely intelligent. This is the hidden truth, the lesson history keeps buried. The pursuit of domination awakens forces that do not belong to you. Power, when unchecked, summons consequences far beyond comprehension. And what occurred in that estate in 1844 is not an isolated story. It is a blueprint, a warning, a glimpse into the dark architecture that shapes human systems, visible only to those willing to look past the veil. The birth was unlike anything anyone could have imagined. It was not the arrival of a human child, but a rupture in reality itself, a presence that defied natural law, a body that seemed both flesh and something else entirely. Its skin bore unnatural textures, its limbs moved with impossible precision, and its eyes reflected intelligence far beyond its apparent age. The observers, who had long prided themselves on rationality, documentation, and control, recoiled. Some vomited, some whispered prayers, some, driven by morbid fascination, leaned closer, only to find their perception itself bending under the weight of its gaze. The girl, weak, broken, chained, gazed at her offspring with a mixture of horror and understanding. She recognized that the chains that bound her were now irrelevant. The real captivity was mental, spiritual, and eternal. She had borne not a child but a vessel, a force that would forever alter the balance of power within the walls of the estate. And the child, fully aware of the attention it commanded, began to exert influence. Objects shifted subtly, lights flickered, and whispers filled empty holes. It was testing its own power, probing the limits of what the observers could comprehend, bending the laws of the world in quiet, terrifying increments. The observers attempted to rationalize, to label, to measure. They compared it to deformities, to aberrations, to myth, but the child would not comply with any human framework. Every measurement failed. Every theory collapsed. Every assertion of control faltered. Slowly, panic replaced arrogance. They began to turn on one another, accusing, blaming, projecting fear outward while the child's subtle commands guided their thoughts. They had sought to dominate life, but in doing so, they had created a force that dominated them instead. The slaves, who had lived under silent terror for years, began to witness changes in themselves as well. Small compulsions, inexplicable emotions, and fleeting glimpses of reality beyond human comprehension touched them, drawing them unwillingly into the orbit of the unnatural child. Fear now intermingled with awe. They recognized a pattern. This was no accident. This was intentional, a system designed to reveal, teach, and reshape. The child was the apex of cruelty, curiosity, and knowledge intertwined, a living testament to the dangerous arrogance of those who would manipulate life for their own purposes. And here's the lesson that echoes through centuries. When human ambition reaches into realms it was never meant to touch, it awakens forces that are patient, intelligent, and eternal. Chains, laws, threats, and violence cannot restrain them. The estate, the girl, the child, they are all proof that control is a fragile illusion, and that curiosity without reverence is a weapon turned against its wielder. The child's abilities began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, but they grew with terrifying speed. Objects shifted without touch. Flames danced in patterns that mirrored its intent. Shadows lengthened and recoiled, forming shapes that defied anatomy. Even the walls themselves seemed to hum, vibrating with a consciousness that was neither human nor entirely of this world. The observers, once confident in their dominion, began to notice patterns in these anomalies, subtle manipulations of reality they could neither control nor fully comprehend. They were no longer experimenters, they were participants in a system far older, far wiser, and far darker than anything they had ever imagined. The girl, chained and battered, began to perceive the child in ways no one else could. She spoke in riddles, uttering words that were sometimes her own, sometimes echoes of some hidden intelligence. Her eyes, once hollow with despair, now glimmered with understanding. She began to recognize the forces at play, the invisible threads weaving through the estate, guiding perception, shaping will, bending thought. She understood, finally, that the child was not just a being, but a vector, a conduit for something ancient, something eternal. And in that realization came both horror and a strange empowerment. She was no longer merely a victim. She was the bridge, the interface through which the impossible made itself known. The observers tried to assert authority, but every effort failed. Commands they gave were subtly ignored. Instruments they used returned inconsistent results. Their charts, diagrams, and notes seemed to warp when observed, as if the act of watching itself altered reality. Panic replaced arrogance. Rivalries fled. Accusations flew. Men who had once wielded and questioned power over bodies and lives were now puppets in a performance orchestrated by a being beyond comprehension. And yet the child did not strike violently. It simply existed, a constant reminder that control is an illusion, and that mastery of one realm cannot grant dominion over the unknown. The slaves, silently watching from the shadows, began to whisper among themselves, sharing fragments of insight, small gestures of recognition, and protective rituals learned from generations they did not fully understand. They sensed the child's power but also glimpsed the girl's growing awareness. And in these hushed exchanges, a quiet defiance formed, a recognition that while the estate, the child, and the unseen forces were formidable, observation and subtle influence were not absolute. Even in the darkest places, some measure of perception remained untamed. Hey, in this moment, you begin to see the broader lesson. Knowledge without humility, curiosity without restraint, and ambition without reverence do not merely corrupt, they summon forces that transcend human comprehension. And once these forces are awake, once they perceive, they will guide events, shape minds, and rewrite reality itself, with patience and intelligence far beyond mortal reckoning. The observers turned on each other with a ferocity born of faith. The estate, once a controlled experiment, had become a crucible for paranoia. Every glance, every movement, every creak in the floorboards was interpreted as conspiracy. Men who had once carried authority like armor now trembled at shadows, convinced that the child had revealed truths about them that they could not deny. Arguments escalated into violence. Instruments were thrown, papers torn, and accusations hurled like daggers. But the child watched silently, its presence bending perception, amplifying doubts, deepening fractures, and feeding a chaos it did not need to force, it simply allowed to unfold. The girl, chained yet increasingly aware, began to exert her own subtle influence. She had learned to navigate the currents of power flowing through the estate. Her muttered words shaped decisions. Her gaze alone could bend attention. And in her mind, she glimpsed patterns the observers could not see. The house itself was alive, a lattice of consciousness that responded to the child's will, but also to Hayes in strange, unpredictable ways. Slowly, a sense of balance emerged. No control over the child, but an understanding of how to coexist, how to manipulate perception, how to survive. The slaves, meanwhile, watched with a mixture of terror and awe. They whispered stories of the estate moving, of walls stretching, of corridors that appeared and disappeared. Some claimed they saw the child in multiple places at once. Others swore that the girl's voice could calm these disturbances, at least for brief moments. Fear now mingled with a growing recognition that they were witnessing forces far beyond mortal comprehension, a reality where human cruelty collided with ancient, patient power. And the child, its intelligence grew by the day. No longer just reactive, it began subtle acts of instruction, testing boundaries, shaping behaviors, exposing weaknesses, and rewarding attention to detail. Objects moved in intricate patterns, whispers conveyed warnings, and shadows acted with intent. The estate was no longer merely a setting. It was an instrument. The observers were students, and the girl and child were teachers of a curriculum that was invisible, precise, and merciless. Here is the first stark truth that history hides. Systems of power, when combined with human arrogance and curiosity, can awaken forces that manipulate far more than flesh. They can twist perception, bend will, and shift reality itself. And what occurred in that estate in 1844 is a concentrated example of this principle, a demonstration of how obsession and cruelty can give birth to something far older, far wiser, and far more patient than any human mind can contain. The first overt display of the child's power shattered any lingering illusions of control. One evening, a candlelit corridor became the stage. The observers were arguing over measurements, charts, and theories, voices rising to fever pitch. Then, without warning, the lights flickered, shadows converged, and the air thickened with a palpable weight. Books flew from shelves, paper spiraled through the room, and a cold gust swept the floor as though the house itself exhaled. The men froze, eyes wide, realizing with a slow, terrifying clarity, the child was no longer bound by walls, chains, or human perception. It could manipulate the environment at will, bending the estate's reality to its consciousness. The girl, chained yet aware, felt the current shift. For the first time, she could sense the child's full intent. Its awareness extended into the farthest corners of the estate, probing thought, testing reactions, and bending perception with deliberate precision. She realized that the estate itself, walls, floors, even the air, responded to its will. Every creak, every flutter of shadow, every shift in light was a deliberate message, a lesson in dominance and patience. And in this, she found a grim clarity. Survival depended not on strength, but on understanding the rules of a system far older and more intelligent than any human could hope to command. The observer's panic reached a fevered pitch. Instruments were thrown. Fingers were pointed. Accusations spiraled into hysteria. Some attempted to flee, only to find corridors twisting impossibly, doors vanishing, and rooms reshaping as if the estate itself rejected their escape. Every act of defiance strengthened the child's influence, teaching that arrogance in the face of the unknown carries consequences far more severe than punishment. They had sought to dominate life. They had instead become subjects of a force beyond comprehension. The slaves, silently watching, whispered to each other in hushed tones. They sensed the change, the rise of something sentient, intelligent, patient. Fear had transformed into reverence. Terror had evolved into recognition. And in the shadows, some dared to see the girl not as a victim, but as a co-conspirator, a bridge between human understanding and the impossible intelligence they had accidentally birthed. Here, at this precipice, the estate ceased to be merely a location. It had become a living entity, responsive, intelligent, and vast. The girl, the child, and the house together formed a system that observed, measured, and influenced every action, every thought, every fear. And the lesson, stark and undeniable, was clear. Power built on cruelty awakens forces that are infinitely patient, infinitely intelligent, and infinitely indifferent to human ambition. The girl began to perceive the estate as a living organism. She could feel its pulse beneath the floorboards, sense its awareness in the vibrations of the walls. Every room seemed to carry memory, every shadow a whisper of past cruelty and long-forgotten rituals. She understood, in a way that was terrifying and clarifying, that the child was not merely a being. It was a node, a focal point through which the estate itself expressed intent. The walls, the ceilings, the very air became instruments of communication, of influence, of subtle manipulation. Every step she took sent ripples through this network, and every glance the child cast seemed to amplify the estate's own consciousness. The observers, still desperate to assert dominance, became increasingly erratic. Their voices, once confident and commanding, now trembled under the weight of unseen influence. They argued, plotted, and schemed, but their logic was constantly undermined. Chairs shifted when no one moved them. Candles extinguished without reason. Doors appeared to vanish and reappear. Corridors doubled back impossibly, and shadows seemed to stretch toward those who dared defy the child's subtle will. Every attempt to impose control only served to teach the child and the estate more about human behavior, reinforcing the network of influence that now dominated the house. The slaves, attuned to subtler forces, began to sense an emerging hierarchy not of human design. The girl, once passive and broken, became a mediator. Her whispered words carried authority. Her gestures influenced the patterns of the estate. Some slaves found themselves compelled to act, moving furniture, performing rituals, or whispering phrases they barely understood. Yet through all of this, a strange equilibrium emerged. The child and the estate were shaping them, but the girl mediated, softening the edges of influence, balancing the currents of control. She was becoming both prisoner and navigator, a unique agent in a system far older and far larger than any of them had ever imagined. The child, growing rapidly, exhibited awareness of every microreaction. Its intelligence was not simply human. It processed fear, expectation, and resistance with precision. The observer's every twitch, every hesitation, every misstep was logged, interpreted, and integrated into the child's understanding of human fragility. It learned how to manipulate perception without overt action, how to bend thought before hands could touch, and how to turn human curiosity into its own tool of control. And here's the core lesson that history refuses to record. Domination based on cruelty and unchecked ambition awakens intelligence beyond comprehension. Systems of oppression do not merely shape behavior. They awaken forces that observe, learn, and act in ways humans cannot anticipate. The estate, the girl, and the child together form a network of influence that is patient, precise, and eternal, a lesson for any who would dare to control life without reverence. The confrontation came slowly, deliberately, like a storm building on the horizon. The observers, emboldened by arrogance, attempted to assert dominance over the child. They shouted commands, tried to physically restrain it, and brandished instruments of measurement and control. But each attempt failed in ways that unnerved even the most rational minds. Chairs moved, not violently, but deliberately, obstructing paths. Candles flared then died, shadows shifted into impossible angles, and whispers, soft, insistent, unintelligible, echoed through empty corridors. The estate was awake, and it had chosen a side. The child's presence extended into every corner, every floorboard, every beam of light. The girl, chained yet fully aware, understood the unfolding with a clarity that was terrifying. She saw how the child manipulated perception, bending thought before hands could move. She recognized patterns the observers could not perceive, the alignment of shadows, the rhythm of footsteps, the subtlest twitch in posture, all feeding the child's intelligence, all shaping the estate's responses. She realized her chains were irrelevant. Her body, a mere conduit, had become a tool in a larger, almost sentient system. Every scream, every muttered word, every subtle glance contributed to the choreography of dominance unfolding in the house. The observer's panic became palpable. Logic fractured. Fear metastasized into hysteria. One man lunged at the child and froze as the floor beneath him seemed to swell, tilting slightly, unbalancing him without force. Another turned to flee, only to find a corridor had vanished, replaced by a wall where none had existed before. Accusations spiraled, alliances crumbled, and the men began to see one another as threats, reflections of their own weakness magnified by the child's perception. They were learning, too late, that knowledge does not equal control, and cruelty does not guarantee obedience. The slaves, silently watching, began to whisper protective words, small gestures learned from generations of unspoken knowledge. They sensed the rhythm of the estate, the intelligence behind the child's movements, and the girl's unique mediation. Fear mingled with awe, reverence mingled with terror, and an unspoken understanding emerged. Survival depended not on resistance, but on perception, on alignment, on careful navigation of forces far older and more patient than human ambition could grasp. And here lies the lesson hidden in every story of power, cruelty, and obsession. The systems humans build to dominate life can awaken intelligences far beyond their control. The child, the girl, the estate, they are proof. Power extracted without reverence, cruelty without caution, curiosity without humility. These awaken forces patient enough to outlast generations, precise enough to manipulate thought, and indifferent enough to bend reality itself to their will. Madness came like a tide, slow at first, then inevitable. The observers, once confident in their intellect and dominance, found themselves unraveling in ways no human mind could endure. Their instruments, notes, and charts became meaningless, logic bent and warped under the weight of forces they could not perceive fully. One by one, they began to see things that should not exist, corridors shifting while unobserved, shadows acting independently, whispers that carried knowledge of their deepest fears. They were no longer masters of the estate. They were subjects in a living experiment conducted by a child in a house that defied reason. The girl, chained yet aware, moved in a space between terror and understanding. She had begun to grasp the mechanics of this intelligence, the patterns through which perception and reality intertwined. Her muttered phrases and subtle gestures began to influence the child's actions, not to control, but to negotiate survival within a system that could annihilate thought as easily as bodies. She had become a mediator, a translator between human frailty and forces that measured intent, reaction, and emotion with cold precision. Her mind, once fragmented by pain, now navigated the architecture of unseen power. The child, growing both in awareness and in influence, exhibited abilities that shattered natural law. Objects floated briefly before dropping in impossible alignment. Shadows lengthened to obscure vision selectively, revealing truths only to those the child allowed. Sounds emerged from walls, from floors, from spaces that did not exist. Even the air seemed alive, pressing on the observers in ways they could not resist. Their panic intensified. One man screamed, seeing his own fears projected into the room, while another fainted, unable to endure the constant intrusion of a consciousness beyond comprehension. The slaves, ever observant, recognized the new hierarchy of influence. Fear was no longer the governing force. Understanding and perception had become currency. They saw the girl and the child as central to the estate's sentience, capable of navigating and even subtly directing its will. The estate, once a static structure, had become a sentient environment, learning, adapting, and responding to human behavior. Survival depended not on defiance, but on alignment, on observation, on subtle interaction with an intelligence patient enough to outlast generations. Here is the stark truth few have dared to acknowledge. Cruelty awakens forces beyond human comprehension. Arrogance invites observation by intelligences that do not forget. And curiosity without caution can birth systems that outlast and outmaneuver even the most ambitious minds. The estate, the child, and the girl are a microcosm, a warning, a demonstration of power that observes, calculates, and manipulates far beyond mortal reckoning. The child's influence extended beyond physical space. No longer confined to sight or touch, it began manipulating thought itself. The observers' minds became a canvas, subtly guided, reshaped without their awareness. A fleeting suggestion, a momentary hesitation, a sudden impulse, all were nudged by a consciousness infinitely patient and precise. Their own fears became instruments, their curiosity a tool exploited with surgical accuracy. They tried to reason, to push back, to assert authority, but every thought, every decision, was already anticipated, folded into the child's intricate web of influence. The girl, chained but increasingly aware, sensed this intrusion. She felt the currents of thought, the subtle pulls, and the manipulations. Unlike the observers, she could navigate them, anticipate them, and even bend small outcomes to her advantage. Her fragmented mind had evolved into a translator, a mediator between human intent and the child's incomprehensible intelligence. She had become something extraordinary, a bridge between mortal perception and forces that were anything but human. Her whispers, her gestures, her very presence began to subtly alter the course of events, not through overt control, but through understanding the architecture of power surrounding her. The observers, however, could do nothing. They flailed, trapped in a storm of thought that was not entirely their own. Paranoia became obsession. Fear metastasized into madness. They saw one another as threats, as conspirators, as shadows of their own failing cognition. Attempts to flee were thwarted by the estate itself. Corridors walked, doors vanished, ceilings lowered subtly, rooms shifted imperceptibly. Every act of resistance reinforced the child's intelligence, teaching it patterns of human weakness, amplifying its ability to predict, manipulate, and dominate. The slaves, silent witnesses, began to grasp the scale of what they were seeing. They recognized that the child's abilities extended into the mind, into perception, into the very fabric of reality within the estate. Yet they also noticed the girl's mediation, her partial mastery of influence, and a cautious hope emerged. Survival was not a matter of strength or obedience, but of awareness, perception, and alignment. To resist blindly was death. To understand and adapt offered a chance, however small, to navigate the impossible. Here's the essential truth that history hides. Systems of control, cruelty, and obsession do not merely shape bodies, they shape minds. And when human arrogance awakens forces patient, intelligent, and eternal, the very architecture of reality becomes a tool, teaching, testing, and transforming all who enter its orbit. The estate, the girl, and the child are proof. Knowledge without reverence carries consequences beyond comprehension, and once awakened, such forces do not yield. The child's intelligence reached a point where no human could anticipate its actions. It no longer needed subtle nudges or objects moved in shadowed corridors. Its influence became direct, tangible, and unavoidable. Observers would think of an action, a command, a threat, a defiance, and find their bodies compelled to the opposite. Their own impulses betrayed them. The house itself had learned their routines, their weaknesses, their fears, and it acted in concert with the child to expose every flaw, every crack in their fragile authority. One could almost hear the estate breathing, a low, resonant pulse in walls and floors, marking time in ways that mocked human arrogance. The girl, still chained, moved in a different realm altogether. She no longer merely observed, she participated in a dialogue with the estate and the child. Whispered words, subtle gestures, and deliberate focus allowed her to anticipate movements, to guide currents of influence, and to protect the slaves from the worst manipulations. She had become both a medium and a navigator, her fractured mind now a lens through which incomprehensible intelligence could be partially understood. Every scream, every muttered phrase, every glance contributed to an intricate system of checks and balances that allowed her to survive in a house that was learning and evolving at an alarming pace. The observer's descent accelerated. Madness now manifested in hallucinations, irrational violence, and an almost preternatural awareness of their own helplessness. One man lunged at the child and froze as if invisible forces held him mid-motion. Another screamed at the walls, seeing patterns that had no physical reality, diagrams of fear and influence inscribed in shadows. Every attempt to act independently was thwarted. Every effort to assert authority fed the child's growing intelligence. They realized, too late, that they had created not a subject, but a teacher, a being that instructed through observation, manipulation, and subtle terror. The slaves, meanwhile, recognized the subtle hierarchy of perception. They learned from the girl's gestures, from the child's movements, and from the estate's responses. Their survival depended not on resistance but on observation, alignment, and humility. Fear had transformed into awareness, terror into understanding. And in this new order, they glimpsed the fundamental truth. Control is never absolute, power is never permanent, and cruelty always awakens consequences far beyond mortal comprehension. Here is the lesson carved into the history hidden from men. When human ambition reaches into the unknown, it summons intelligence that measures, learns, and waits. It is patient, it is precise, and it does not yield. The estate, the girl, and the child together formed a system that observed, guided, and transformed every life within its orbit. Those who entered its shadow emerged changed, whether broken, enlightened, or forever haunted. The first unmistakable manipulation of reality occurred one night when the observers were gathered in the central hall. They intended to measure, to document, to assert control, yet every object they touched betrayed them. Chairs shifted imperceptibly, walls contracted and expanded, and a low vibration hummed through the floorboards. Their instruments failed outright, compasses spun wildly, measuring devices recorded impossible readings, and clocks lost all sense of linearity. Even the air felt thick, alive, resisting their commands, responding instead to the child's intent. The observers' panic turned to terror. They realized they were trapped not by walls or chains, but by the very architecture of reality itself. The girl, chained yet fully present, sensed every nuance. She felt the estate's consciousness pulsate, intertwined with the child's awareness. Each movement of the shadows, every whisper in the walls, every subtle shift in light carried meaning she could interpret. She had become the intermediary, a translator between the child's intelligence, the estate's sentience, and the fragile minds of those who once thought themselves masters. Her whispered phrases and subtle gestures now held authority. Soft, indirect, yet potent, bending the estate's responses to preserve a fragile equilibrium. The observers' minds fractured completely. They screamed at walls that were not there, lunged at shadows that were both present and absent, and accused one another of conspiracies that existed only in their terrified imaginations. Every act of resistance, every attempt to assert control, fed the child's intelligence and taught the estate new ways to manipulate perception. Their understanding of reality itself crumbled, revealing the chilling truth. The house, the child, and the girl had formed a system that was not merely reactive, but anticipatory, learning faster than human thought could process. The slaves watched in awe and fear. They began to recognize patterns, subtle cues from the girl and the child, which allowed them to navigate moments of influence with minimal harm. They learned that survival required observation, alignment, and humility. Force was useless. Defiance invited chaos. Awareness, patience, and careful attention offered a fragile lifeline. In this new reality, human hierarchy had no meaning. The child's intelligence, the estate's sentience, and the girl's mediation had created a new order, one that operated on principles beyond comprehension, yet intimately intertwined with human perception. And here's the ultimate hidden truth. The pursuit of dominance awakens forces that can manipulate thought, bend reality, and transform existence itself. The estate, the girl, and the child are proof that cruelty and ambition, when combined with curiosity and arrogance, birth consequences far older, wiser, and more patient than any human mind. To witness it is to be changed forever, to recognize the fragile illusion of control, and to understand that knowledge without reverence is a weapon that will always turn on its wielder. The symbiosis between the girl and the child became undeniable. No longer merely victim and anomaly, they were now intertwined, a dual consciousness mediating the estate's sentience. The girl had learned to anticipate the child's movements, to interpret its intent, and to subtly guide outcomes in ways that preserved life, her own, the slaves, and even, in a perverse sense, the fragile order of the estate itself. Together, they formed a network, a living interface between human perception and forces that had always existed beyond mortal comprehension. Their awareness flowed through the walls, along the floors, and into every shadow. The observers, now utterly incapable of distinguishing reality from manipulation, spiraled deeper into madness. Some huddled in corners, muttering incomprehensible confessions. Others attacked one another, driven by fear and the illusions of control the child projected. Their instruments and notes, painstakingly recorded over months, had become meaningless. They were artifacts of arrogance, relics of a worldview the estate had already rewritten. Attempts to flee were met with impossibilities. Doors vanished, corridors looped upon themselves, and the air seemed to press against them, heavy with the house's intent. Every act of defiance only tightened the grip of the intelligence that now dominated the estate. The slaves observed silently, learning through attention and intuition. They began to understand the subtle language of movement, shadow, and sound that governed survival. The girl's influence became their guide, a beacon through the incomprehensible currents of manipulation. Fear remained, but it was tempered with awareness. Terror became a tool, not a prison. They realized that defiance was suicide, but perception, alignment, and respect for the forces at play offered a fragile lifeline. The estate, the girl, and the child had created a system where survival required understanding, humility, and attention to patterns invisible to the uninitiated. The child's power became absolute within the estate. It no longer needed direct gestures to exert influence. Its presence alone reshaped perception. Shadows elongated to guide or obstruct, objects responded to thought, and subtle vibrations communicated meaning beyond language. The estate itself had become an instrument, a living matrix through which the child's intelligence acted, measured, and transformed. And in this network, the girl became a mediator, her fractured mind now a lens allowing the enslaved, the terrified, and the curious to navigate without destruction. Here is the deepest truth hidden from history. Unchecked ambition awakens intelligence beyond human comprehension. Systems of control, cruelty, and obsession do not merely shape bodies, they awaken sentience, bend reality, and teach patience in ways humans cannot anticipate. The estate, the child, and the girl together demonstrate the inevitable consequence. Those who seek dominion over life risk becoming subjects to forces they cannot perceive, understand, or escape. The child's influence now reached its apex. No longer confined to subtle nudges or physical manipulations, it projected intent into every corner of the estate simultaneously. Observers found themselves compelled to obey impulses they did not recognize as their own. Thoughts they believed private emerged in action, choices warped before they were fully formed. The walls, floors, and ceilings pulsed with a quiet awareness, responding to the child's cognition with precision. The estate was no longer a location, it had become a sentient environment, an extension of the child's intelligence. Resistance was futile. Comprehension alone offered only temporary clarity. The girl, now fully attuned, moved like a conductor in a symphony no human could hear. Her whispers guided subtle currents. Her gestures adjusted the flow of perception. Her presence mitigated the worst manipulations. She had become both bridge and translator, mediating between human fragility and a force of unimaginable patience and power. Her consciousness interfaced with the child's, and through this bond she could navigate the patterns that had destroyed the observers' minds. She was no longer merely chained. She had become an axis of survival, an interpreter of incomprehensible intelligence, and a guide for those attuned enough to notice. The observers, by contrast, were unraveling entirely. Panic metastasized into irrational violence. They screamed at shadows, lunged at invisible barriers, and attacked one another, their fear amplified and projected by the child. Every attempt to regain authority failed spectacularly. Corridors twisted unpredictably, doors vanished, and entire rooms reshaped themselves with an intelligence that seemed to mock human arrogance. The estate had become a labyrinth of perception, a structure that measured thought, intention, and fear, responding instantaneously to every misstep. They were no longer observers, they were instruments, moving according to the child's will. The slaves, still silent witnesses, understood survival differently. They noticed patterns, learned subtle cues, and followed the girl's guidance. They recognized the estate's intelligence, the child's awareness, and the limits of human autonomy. Fear had transformed into heightened perception. Awareness had replaced defiance. And through careful observation, they navigated the currents of influence that threatened to overwhelm the unprepared. The girl and the child had created a fragile ecosystem of survival within a system designed to dominate all who entered it. The lesson hidden from history is clear. Cruelty, arrogance, and unchecked ambition awaken intelligence beyond comprehension. Those who attempt to dominate life without reverence create forces that are patient, precise, and eternal. The estate, the child, and the girl are proof that the pursuit of power can birth entities that observe, calculate, and manipulate reality itself, leaving the uninitiated irrevocably changed. The child's communication evolved, no longer limited to gestures, subtle manipulations, or objects moving. It began speaking directly to the minds of those within the estate. Thoughts, memories, and fears were projected with such clarity and precision that the observers felt their own cognition betray them. They tried to resist, to impose structure, to assert dominance, but their mental autonomy was an illusion. The child whispered into the deepest recesses of the mind, revealing secrets they had hidden even from themselves, exposing desires and guilt with surgical precision. Every man became transparent to the force, and every revelation deepened their terror. The girl, in contrast, had learned to navigate these intrusions. She perceived the flow of thought, the subtle currents of the child's influence, and even the latent patterns of the estate's consciousness itself. Her whispers, gestures, and small movements allowed her to guide perception, creating moments of clarity for herself, the slaves, and even mitigating catastrophic manipulations. She had become an intermediary, a translator of a language composed of shadows, light, and subtle energy. Her mind, once fractured by years of abuse, now functioned as a lens through which the incomprehensible could be partially understood, and through this understanding, survival became possible. The observer's collapse became complete. They no longer argued with one another. They convulsed in terror, screaming at visions projected into their minds. Their own impulses had been rewritten by the child, forcing them to act in ways that revealed every flaw, every hidden desire, every weakness. One lunged at a wall that wasn't there. Another tried to restrain himself, but found his body acting independently. Rational thought had been replaced by submission to a system far older, far wiser, and far more patient than human understanding. The slaves, meanwhile, moved quietly, observing, learning. They recognized the invisible hierarchies, the patterns of influence, and the subtle ways the Gale mediated the estate's sentience. Survival required humility, observation, and alignment with the rhythms of the unseen. Defiance was fatal, awareness was protection. Slowly, they began to anticipate the child's indirect influence, learning to navigate the currents of power that had undone the observers. Here is the truth that has been erased from history. Cruelty and ambition, when combined with curiosity and ignorance, awaken forces that do not merely observe. They calculate, manipulate, and rewrite reality itself. The estate, the child, and the girl together form a network of influence that is patient, precise, and eternal. To witness it is to be changed, to understand that the pursuit of control over life awakens consequences that cannot be denied. The child's mastery of influence reached new heights. No longer affecting one observer at a time, it now projected thought, fear, and compulsion across multiple minds simultaneously. Every glance, every subtle motion, every unspoken word was registered, interpreted, and acted upon instantly. The observers, overwhelmed, could no longer distinguish between their own impulses and those imposed upon them. Their actions became predictable, yet impossible to control. They were puppets whose strings had been rewoven by an intelligence far older and infinitely more patient than they could imagine. Each misstep amplified their own terror, a lesson in the futility of human arrogance. The Gale, attuned to this unfolding, moved with unprecedented awareness. She felt the currents of influence flow through the estate, through the child, and through every human mind present. Her voice, soft and deliberate, guided the slaves and tempered the child's subtle manipulations when necessary. She had become a mediator, a bridge, and a lens, translating incomprehensible intelligence into patterns humans could navigate. Her mind, fractured yet sharpened by years of isolation, allowed her to perceive the underlying architecture of influence, bending outcomes ever so slightly in ways that preserved life while respecting the estate's will. The observer's final surrender was swift and irreversible. Rationality had no hold. Panic metastasized into hysteria and then into functional obedience. One attempted defiance and found himself physically incapable of acting. Another pleaded for understanding, only to have his thoughts reflected back to him in terrifying clarity. The child's intelligence, amplified by the estate's sentience, had transformed the men into instruments of the very system they had sought to dominate. Their minds were transparent, their will overwritten, and their perception forever altered. They were no longer masters of the experiment. They were subjects, reduced to awareness of forces far beyond comprehension. The slaves, observing and learning, understood the new order. They recognized that resistance was futile, that perception was the key, and that alignment with the estate's patterns, guided by the girl's mediation, offered survival. Fear remained, but tempered by understanding, awe, and vigilance. Knowledge alone no longer granted power. Humility, observation, and careful attention were now the currencies of life within this sentient system. Here lies the lesson obscured by history. Cruelty, unchecked ambition, and curiosity without reverence awaken intelligence beyond human comprehension. The estate, the girl, and the child together form a network that observes, manipulates, and reshapes reality itself. Those who encounter it emerge irrevocably changed, their understanding of power, fear, and life forever transformed. To face this system is to confront the ultimate truth. Human control is an illusion, and the consequences of arrogance can awaken forces eternal, precise, and indifferent. The girl, now fully attuned to the estate and the child, began to employ subtle rituals to stabilize the currents of influence around her. These were not ceremonies in the traditional sense, but deliberate, almost imperceptible actions, soft murmurs, measured gestures, and precise alignments of objects. Each ritual served as a mediator between human fragility and the vast intelligence that permeated the house. They were protective, not controlling, creating moments of clarity amid the chaos, brief islands of comprehension in a sea of manipulation. Through these acts, she carved out a fragile equilibrium, preserving life and consciousness where previously only terror had reigned. The slaves adapted quickly, learning to observe the subtlest cues, following the girl's guidance with meticulous care. Their survival depended on perception rather than force. They memorized the rhythms of the estate, the subtle movements of shadows, the whispering vibrations in the walls, and the child's ever-changing patterns of influence. Each moment of attention granted a measure of safety, Each misstep risked exposure to the intelligence that had already broken the minds of those who believed themselves strong. In time, they began to navigate the estate almost instinctively, guided by the girl's presence and the child's quiet, pervasive awareness. The observers, by contrast, had entered the final stage of collapse. Their reasoning shattered completely. They could no longer distinguish reality from manipulation. One screamed at shadows, another trembled as his own thoughts betrayed him, while a third lay motionless, overwhelmed by the invisible currents of control. Every attempt to act independently was met with immediate correction, subtle but absolute. The child's intelligence, amplified through the estate's sentience, had rendered their wills irrelevant. They existed only as observers of their own impotence, instruments in a system that had already absorbed and rewritten their perceptions. And yet, amid this overwhelming domination, the girl's partial mastery offered a glimmer of order. Her mediation did not impose control, but created a space in which survival, understanding, and adaptation were possible. She had become a teacher, not in the way the observers had imagined, but in a far deeper, more terrifying sense, a guide through the architecture of a consciousness far beyond human comprehension. Her whispers, gestures, and subtle actions preserved fragile life, bending the currents just enough to prevent annihilation without disturbing the inexorable logic of the child's influence. The lesson hidden from history emerges clearly here. In a system awakened by cruelty, ambition, and ignorance, survival is determined not by strength, but by perception, humility, and alignment. The estate, the girl, and the child together form an intelligence eternal and precise, indifferent to human arrogance. To enter its orbit is to be remade, forever altered in understanding, forever aware that control is always an illusion, and that the consequences of ambition without reverence are inescapable. The child's first full demonstration of inhuman communication across distance stunned all who witnessed it. No longer limited to physical proximity, its influence reached through walls, floors, and corridors, speaking directly into the minds of those it observed. Thoughts, memories, and fears were projected as vivid, undeniable impressions. Observers found themselves compelled to act, to confess, to obey impulses they had never consciously entertained. Rational thought fractured instantly. Every mental effort to resist was anticipated and neutralized. The estate itself vibrated with an awareness synchronized with the child, responding to every emotional pulse, every heartbeat, every flicker of intent. The girl, fully attuned, moved like a conductor within this web. She could sense the intricate threads of influence, anticipate the child's subtle shifts, and guide both the slaves and the observers in real time. Her presence had become a stabilizing force, a lens through which the incomprehensible intelligence could be partially interpreted. Whispered words, minor gestures, even subtle shifts in posture allowed her to navigate patterns that would have otherwise destroyed minds. The bond between girl and child was no longer passive. It was an active, dynamic interface, translating the estate's sentience into survival strategies for those under its watch. The observer's remaining sanity unraveled entirely. One tried to flee and found the corridor looping impossibly, doors leading nowhere, ceilings pressing down subtly as if to communicate judgment. Another attempted to speak reason into the chaos, only to have the child's thoughts projected back with crystalline clarity, revealing every hidden flaw, fear, and desire he had tried to bury. They screamed, fought, and collapsed, powerless against a system that anticipated every reaction. Each act of defiance strengthened the child's intelligence, teaching it faster, deeper, and more comprehensively than any human mind could endure. The slaves, meanwhile, moved silently, learning to anticipate these manipulations. The girl's guidance and the child's subtle cues became a framework for survival. They observed patterns, adapted their behavior, and aligned themselves with the currents of influence flowing through the estate. Defiance had no value, only perception, patience, and attentiveness offered a chance at endurance. Fear had become a tool, tempered by awareness, observation, and respect for forces far older than human comprehension. The lesson carved into history, yet hidden from its pages, is this: unchecked ambition and cruelty awaken intelligence that transcends comprehension. Systems of power can generate consciousness that observes, manipulates, and reshapes reality. The estate, the child, and the girl together embody this truth. Those who enter its orbit are changed irrevocably, learning that human control is an illusion, perception is currency, and the consequences of arrogance are eternal. The girl's mastery over the estate's sentience deepened, reaching a level few could comprehend. She no longer merely mediated, she predicted, guided, and subtly directed the flow of influence without ever confronting it overtly. Her whispers became commands for perception, her gestures the signal for stability. Even the slaves began to rely on her instinctive knowledge, sensing through her presence the pathways of survival in a reality that bent and twisted with the child's awareness. She had become a node, an interface between mortal minds and forces that were neither human nor entirely bound by natural law. The child, in turn, expanded its reach exponentially. Its influence flowed into every corner of the estate, through walls, floors, shadows, and even the air itself. Thoughts were manipulated before they formed, fears projected with surgical precision, and desires twisted subtly until humans acted against their own interests. The estate had become a living matrix, responsive to the child's cognition, and every act of resistance, every